Three.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to The Only You, the English version of Solo 2, and our live broadcast here is our second one. Figuring some things out, getting a little more comfortable with it. We really do appreciate you being in the audience live, and if you could, please take advantage of it. Ask questions of the doctor. We'll see them on his screen, and we'll respond in kind. How are you doing today, Dr. Patino?
It's been a long day. I mean, working hard. We're still not hitting the middle of the week, but here we go. We're doing well. We're busy. We're seeing, unfortunately, a lot of suffering. But things are moving in the right direction. I'm more optimistic today than I was in December, as things are moving ahead. I think that we're starting to see some light at the end of the tunnel, and that really helps us really get into doing better planning. I mean, one of the problems with this whole pandemic is that planning has been thrown down sideways. We don't have the ability to plan because everything is so unpredictable. And as we've talked before, uncertainty, the mother of all anxieties. So how we master that leads us into better places in the future.
Yeah, I think the vaccine is definitely making a shift in people's mentality toward it. Even the anti-maskers and people who think this is real, they're all lining up to take that vaccine. It is definitely changing people's perception of what's going on and their attitude, I think, a little bit.
The whole vaccine rollout is being done in a better organized way. I think that people are starting to feel more comfortable and receiving more confidence from the people who are at the authority level that are providing guidance into how to do this. I think we still have a fairly large group of the population who are, I would say, more reluctant, if you may, right? Whether it's for political reasons or scientific reasons or religious reasons, the reluctance is still there. And I think that we in the healthcare arena, we all have a responsibility to guide people in the principles that we talked about in one of my writings a few weeks ago in terms of the risks, risk of getting the vaccine, the benefit of getting the vaccine, and the risk of doing nothing, because everything has a risk. And we have to keep reminding people of that without necessarily being frustrated with them, because it's easy to get frustrated with people. And I think that sometimes people want to get you frustrated so they can feel validated in terms of making you feel defensive. And I think that we have a saying in Mexico that says, once you start defending yourself, you're already lost. Right?
Absolutely, absolutely. One of the things that I've noticed that's still of great contention is kids going back to school. And even beyond that, I've seen a lot of anxiety because of the younger people that I work with, my stepdaughter, and it's they just seem to in this kind of like bizarre netherworld. They're not quite sure what they can do, what they can't do. They still have those feelings of being invincible. We all did when we were young, but also being concerned about you work with adolescents every day. What are you seeing out
I see the whole spectrum. I see kids who are balanced. I see kids who are extremely intelligent and intellectually mature. And I see kids who are severely emotionally immature, right? But you see, in order for us to understand teenagers, we have to understand what is the purpose of adolescence, right? We have to recognize it as a station in the development of something. And for practical purposes, adolescents' intelligence seems to mature faster than their ability to develop emotional maturity, right? And in part, we call it phylogenetic reason for that. Okay, they're smart, but they're easily frustrated. And in part, the ultimate goal of adolescence is separation from your parents, right? I mean,
Mm.
whether it was 10,000 years ago or whether it's today, and whether our concept of adolescence has changed over the years in terms of when people live 30 years, well, what was adolescence, right? So things have changed over time. Now we live 80 plus years, so adolescence seem to be getting a little extended, right? From the what you and I knew, from 13 to 18 or 19. Well, not anymore. And there's a reason for that, and is that from a biological point of view, you're not fully neurologically mature until the age of about 25, right? You can say that an adult at the age of 25 is getting all the connections they're going to have. And if they lose some, they may get it replaced because the brain can repair itself. But if you bring it back to adolescence, you can basically say they don't have all their brain connections fully developed, right? They have emotional immaturity and they get easily frustrated. How is that helpful in any way? It is helpful because for adolescents, it's a lot easier to separate being angry than separate being sad. They don't handle sadness very well. So they'll argue with you intellectually, right? And they will tell you how much things make sense to them. But you place them in a situation of uncertainty and they can't handle it. So from that perspective, it becomes important to understand that this is a process that is natural. It's a process that must happen and it has to have a beginning and an end, right? And to move into adult maturity. Okay. Now, what we're seeing now is that because of the way we manage kids, right, we have forgotten to allowing them the opportunity to take risks. So we have done a lot of helicopter parenting. What does that mean? It means that instead of letting kids run free, which maybe has been done a little extreme in the past, we put them in a box, right? And the kids go from one box to another box to another box until they get the house box, right? And all of that is predetermined and implies no risk. So what is happening in a paradoxical way is that kids have lost some of that little malice that you have to have that is good for your own protection. Your ability to recognize danger, your ability to know where to go, your ability to take risks with people in terms of trusting, right? So kids have not developed as much of an ability to that. And I think that to some degree it's been our responsibility because we're afraid. And one of the problems that I see most commonly now, because I treat pathological adolescents every day, a lot of what I see is parents being afraid of the kids, parents being afraid of disciplining, parents being afraid of setting boundaries, parents being afraid of saying no, right? Because something catastrophic may happen, right? And what needs to happen is that there needs to be kind of a two extreme approach that needs to happen into allowing kids to take more risks and calculate a risk and getting to know their environment. And on the other hand, not be afraid of being a parent, right? So that evolution has happened more at the parents' side than the kids' side. Kids have not changed that much, right? They have the same drives, they have the same reptilian impulses that adolescents have, right? That's not different, but what is different is that they're having a lot more difficulty trusting their environment. Okay, and I'm not sure. I'm much older than most adolescents. I'm not sure that the world is more dangerous today than it was 50 years ago, right? I don't have a very good way of measuring that. There's not a lot of data for that. But I think that we are more scared, and that's problematic.
It's interesting you said that. I have
Now,
read some things concerning that. They say that technically, again, people say we're in this dangerous world. We're in the least violent time in all of our human history. The least amount of larger wars, the least amount of crime. We hear more about it because of the news media and things like that. But on a statistical basis, we're actually in one of the safest times when it comes to interpersonal violence than we have been in all of human history.
Yeah, and I remember a couple of years ago, maybe more, and you probably remember this case of a woman that called Child Protective Services because a 10-year-old kid was walking his younger sister, who was 6, to school. That's what I'm talking about. That type of fear, right? That these kids have probably been doing that for a very long time. The parents were comfortable with the risk, right? But somebody feels that that's not adequate, right? And that is problematic because we see it in a lot of different aspects of the kids' environment and behavior, whether it's sports, whether it's academia, whether it's dating, you know, in which we have lost the ability to set the boundaries with the kids in a way that they respect your authority, right? And I know that's going to sound old fashioned, but kids get very upset with me because I always tell them, listen, and I used it an hour ago because I was dealing with an adolescent who's very defiant and oppositional and not following the rules at home. And and I was wondering, she said, well, I don't like the idea that my mom is always right. I don't like the idea that my mom has all this authority, right? I want her to explain to me why I have to do what she tells me to do. And it was obvious to me that underneath that, there was a very insecure teenager, right? And on top of that, had attention deficit disorder. So it was very reactive, okay, and easily frustrated. So the only way she could maintain communication with mom was by arguing with mom, right? So what happens is that they will get into an argument and everybody gets upset, and the kid will say, well, I would rather end my life, right? But there's no end to that. So I tell the kid, what's in it for you? And she couldn't answer that question. She couldn't answer what was the purpose of doing that, right? But she was sure that it wasn't correct. It wasn't right for the mom to be telling her what to do all the time. And I told her, well, let me tell you the bad news, for as long as you have a place to live, education, food, you know, shelter, and not being abused, it's not the only rights you have. Everything outside of that is a responsibility. And I was kind of modeling for mom a little bit because I was doing it without me being upset, right? Because what happens is once a kid gets you mad, you might as well walk away, right? You might as well just go to a different room and say, we'll talk about this later because you already lost. You already lost that battle because now you have to defend your position. Parents have nothing to defend, you know? They don't have to defend telling the kids to wash the dishes or to pick up the garbage, right? Especially during these times of COVID, when the kids are not doing school because they're not doing school. That's for another program, right? They're pretending to be doing school, but they basically most kids have lost a year. And the other part is that the kids are spending the whole day in video games and Facebook and media and talking to their friends. But if you tell them to get the garbage out, it's a crisis,
Because
right?
you're interrupting that
But that
system.
that process needs to start with the kids 6 years old, right? Not with the kids 13. Because we need to understand that we're educating our kids for the rest of their life. So this kid that I'm talking about, one of them was 17 and a half. He's going to be 18 in about 6 months, right? And she's going to go to a bigger playground with more dangerous playmates and a lot more risks and make it a job, right? And let's say that the kid decides uh, to treat her boss the way she treats mom. Guess what's going to happen? You see, What kids don't get is that we as parents don't have a choice, right? We have to take it. I mean, especially with teenagers, you better be ready for them to beat you up a couple of times and you take a step back and don't retaliate, right? Because in a way, kids attacking you is them communicating with you. The worst thing that can happen with a teenager is that you're not communicating with them. We also need to realize that we have a lot less control than we think we do. So we have to stay connected with that. So I always like to say, you've heard me say this before, listen to the kid, swallow your pride, take a deep breath, and tell them, I hear you. You know, how do you want me to help you? Do you need a hug? Right? It's a lot easier to yell and scream and tell them how terrible they are, you know. But we as parents have to listen, right? Doesn't mean that we're giving up any power, any control. It just means that we're listening because you want to know what is the kid trying to tell you, right? So back to the kids that I see every day, because this morning my team had 56 adolescent kids, 2/3 of which are suicidal, maybe another 10 who are psychotic, you know. So when a kid comes to me and he tells me, I wanted to kill myself, and I want to know, what are you trying to tell me by telling me that, right? In part because if they're in the hospital, well, whether they were either not successful or they weren't trying very hard. That doesn't mean that they're not serious. It means that taking away your life is a very difficult thing to do. And the kid is trying to tell me something. So part of my job is to try to understand, not to judge, right? So step number one is don't make judgments. In today's society, it's extremely difficult to not judge, right? Because everybody's judging all the time, even more, right? You get into social media like this, and people are looking at you to try to figure out, what am I going to judge that guy on? Not listening to what I'm saying. What is he wrong about, right? And we have moved away from listening to learn, which brings me to the idea of, and I can't forget this, which is, what is the purpose of life? What are we here for? And I know it sounds like an extremely philosophical question that can be
Existential
answered in
questions, yeah.
religious, existential question, but I want to answer it for you. Do you know what we're here for? We're here to transfer information. That's what we're here for. Okay, we transfer genetic information, we transfer psychological information, we transfer social experience, and then we die. We're transferring information. So we have to make sure that we're transferring information the right way. Yeah? We're transferring the information to the right people. And that the information we're transferring, whether it's genetics, psychology, experience, social environment, educational skills, whatever information we're giving is going to be used and is going to be perpetuated, right? It's going to be continued over time because that's what it's all about. I mean, you can say, well, we also transfer in religious information. You pick one. And that's our job. It's our job to transfer information. So instead of saying, I'm making a lot of money, okay, or I'm being very, very successful and a lot of people admires me, and all the narcissistic stuff we've been dealing for the last 4 years, the question is, are we transferring the right information? And that's not an easy question to answer, right?
Well, it's interesting. I just read an article about that, that even physicists are talking about, our realities and things of that nature. And one of them, in one article I read, that the universe is basically a large neural network, which would support that concept that everything we're doing is simply moving data.
Yes. Yeah, it's a lot more sophisticated because the data is moving at unbelievable speeds. I mean, there are not enough computers in the world to do what one brain does.
Yep.
Okay, simple as that. And does it with energy that comes from the food that you take, and 20% of your energy that you consume, it goes to your brain. The smallest organs in your body uses 20% of your energy. Just think about the amount of information that is being transferred. Not only that, I mean, we as humans, transmitters of information and data, from one generation to another, basically have sensors that no electric automobile or a self-driving automobile has, right? We can sense things. We can feel people. I mean, there's so many things in our body that are so fabulous, right? That kids like adolescents don't realize. A lot of the things that we take for granted. And I think that part of the information that we're missing with our kids is values,
And
right?
values is what make up a human being.
Because, well, but again, and I've said this before, every time I ask a kid what makes you valuable is how many friends I have, what my parents do, I'm good at music, people like me, uh, I'm a good writer. And I said, well, stop. The answer is in the question, what makes you valuable? They can't say values. They have never heard it. They don't understand it. And then I say, okay, are you capable of being caring? Yes. Are you capable of being loving? Absolutely. Are you capable of giving and compassion and understanding and empathy, right? Being industrious, being respectful. And they'll most of them will say yes to all of those because it's true. They have those values. Once they don't recognize it. Second, okay, we as parents don't recognize that that's what makes it valuable. That they're good people, right? Because we have bought into the idea that success or performance is a value. Those are not values, those are things we do. Is the value that drives you to perform, is the value that drives you to success, that is the important thing. Because what happens is when you set your value based on your performance or success and you lose it, you have nothing. You have a crisis, basically. And that's sad. That's the sad part. Sometimes I like to say that's when I have to wake up in the morning and go to the hospital and have a fight with the devil every day, right? Because these kids are giving up. And that's not fair to them because they didn't get the information we were trying to pass. Whether because of biological reasons or psychological reasons or social reasons or family or domestic violence, whatever the reason, they didn't get it. Okay. So how can they get it now? How can we get into the process of giving them the tools necessary so they can take risks in life without having to either destroy themselves or somebody else? Because that's what I see every day.
So in a way, the home life, the abuse, the neglect, all those things are really just impediments to that data being transferred in a healthy manner.
Correct. Yes, it's a little more complicated than that, but it's a good way of saying it.
Well, that's my job to make
And
it
what is
simple. Your
very
job is to
interesting.
explain the complicated.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that, but the reality is that what you said makes a lot of sense, and I never thought about it that way, and I'm glad that you brought it up because it makes sense in one thing in particular, which is that the most damaging thing to the kid's soul or persona or personality is neglect. Because neglect, you see, the transfer of data from kids parents to kids. It's a two-way street. The kid wants it. The kid wants your recognition, your admiration. They want your information. Okay. And they are like sponges. They will just take it all in, right? If you stop that process, the kid will never, ever say there's something wrong with my parents. 99.9% of the time is going to say, what's wrong with me? So the problem with neglect is that quite pervasive on giving the kid the idea that there is something inadequate about them. And you and I have talked about this when a kid isn't giving the kid a ball, football, with a label that says inadequate, right? And then you start giving it to them by neglecting them, and then they throw it back, and then you give it back to them until one day they grab the ball, right? And they get convinced that that ball belongs to them, right? And when they become teenagers, they hide it. They don't want anybody to see it because they don't want to be rejected. They don't want to be criticized. They want to be accepted, right? So they were going to find a group that is going to accept them and be part of it. But they're still carrying the ball, right? And the ball says inadequate. And that's what they really believe about themselves until we get to a point in which it becomes a crisis, right? When they are being confronted with having to take emotional risks with people and they get rejected and they feel it is the end of the world. And then they come to me, right? They come to the psychiatrist because they're depressed, they're anxious, they're suicidal, all of that stuff. And I say, you know what? I recognize that you've been carrying this ball since you were little, you know? Give it to me. And you know what they say now? Because that's all I know. If I don't have my feeling of inadequacy, I have nothing. So I'm not going to give you my ball, right? Now, in fairness to most people, we all carry a little ball of inadequacy, right? And that is because part of the transfer of information in an adequate way with kids and adolescents is kind of like an appreciation depreciation process. So we we do kind of calculated frustration with our kids, right? We're frustrated, but not too much, because when you frustrate them a little bit, they try a little harder. You know that you're a sports coach, right? So you know that you have to do a little bit of frustration, but you don't want to be excessive with it. So the balance of these kids growing up is going to become their personality when they grow older, right? Which is, and that's for another session here on the podcast. But the whole issue of personality is a fascinating thing to me because just to whet your appetite, there's no such a thing as normal personality. It's one of those things in psychology and psychiatry in which we're very good at defining what's abnormal and not very good at defining what's normal, right? So that is somewhat problematic to some degree.
Yes, it's funny as you were talking. I keep thinking about the lacrosse field because I was a coach and how I dealt with a lot of my players and got the performance out of them. And yeah, you had to be very careful. You had to challenge them at a certain level, but not be abusive. Some kids needed the high five. Some kids needed the high five from their friends, not from you. There was a lot of manipulation in certain ways for individual players, and as a group, there had to be buy-in to that whole process. What are we trying to achieve in a season? And something you alluded to about that is when you have a support team for any mental health issue or a mental health problem, if you don't have buy-in from all the players, the parents, the teachers, the kid himself, that becomes very difficult to achieve anything, or at least something of a high
Well,
level.
well, the group dynamics and the individual dynamics, right? So you have to kind of balance both. You have the group that has to have common goals, that has to have kind of trust among each other.
Mhm.
And there's always some degree of tension among different people in the group. And I think a lot of the job of the coach is to identify that tension and try to diffuse it. And on the individual level, what I find really fascinating is kids will try to connect with you, but it's not easy for them to trust. So you have to maintain a very neutral attitude toward them if you want them to trust you, because you're asking them to trust you with very painful things for them, right? So it's not easy for people to present themselves as being the effective one, and second as being broken in another sense. So it becomes difficult for people in general, kids in particular, to trust you. So part of my job is in part of my training over the last 30 some years has been to figure out how to, right? And it's fascinating because it's very unique to each kid. I mean, if you were talking to my students, they will tell you that there's certain things that I do a lot with most of the kids, but there's some things that I do specifically with each kid, and it has to do with my sense of empathy and what I'm feeling from the kid, right? So those things are like the art of therapy and psychiatry versus the science of it, which is the brain and the medications and all of that. Uh, because at the end of the day, and this is painful for kids to hear, especially when they're teenagers, is that, and this is true for you and it's true for me, we all we have. You see, we are social animals. We socialize and live together and have families and all of that. All of that is great. But at the end of the day, the only person you go to bed with and wake up with every single day of your life is you. Everybody else is borrowed, right? Some people are borrowed for a long time. Some people are not borrowed for a long time, but they're borrowed. So this idea of possession, my wife, my child, my husband, it's a fantasy. Okay. If you have a wife and you have a child and you have a husband and they want to be with you, you should be thankful for that. Because being with you is a choice, right? It's a little more complicated than the choice because we have conventionalisms that have to do with society and religion and all that. I understand that, but at the end of the day, people should be where they want to be. Okay. The question is, are you comfortable with the person you wake up in the morning every morning? You. Or are you having to live your life distracting yourself from you?
Hmm.
Right? So that balance of giving, okay, and taking requires that you know what you have to give. If you don't believe that you're worth anything, okay, you're not going to believe that you're worth giving yourself to anybody, right? And that's where you get into issues of interdependency and codependency, and I'm nobody without you. That sounds very romantic, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think
It's
some books have
a
been
lot.
written about that.
Don't go and practice any of this at home with your wife, okay? Please. You know what I think about those things.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. It's my father of the maybe 1,000 words he spoke to me as a kid growing up. One of the wiser things he said was, "Don't be with somebody because you need something from them, and don't let somebody be with you because they need something from you. Be with them simply because you want to be." And I've said this to my wife, and she gets a little upset. She's like, "Wait a minute, you're supposed to need me." I'm like, "No, I don't. I choose to be with you. I love you. I care about you. I
Right.
choose this. There's nothing keeping me here except for the choice to be with you, and I'll take the lumps and bumps that go along with it. But it's not a codependency issue. It's just a choice. I think that's
Well, not,
healthy.
not only that, the ideal situation of two people being together because they want to be together and they don't need each other does not exist, okay? I mean, that's good for educational purposes, but it's not practical because we need safety, right? So there's got to be a balance between choice and need, okay? But I think that you always have to have more choice and less need, okay? Um, it's like love, and my kids get upset sometimes. I still have an 18-year-old daughter and two older ones. And I say, love is a promise that cannot be kept.
Mm.
You should never tell someone I'm going to love you forever because you don't know. It sounds very beautiful, and it feels good. It's like telling somebody I need you, right? Okay, right? But you can make those promises. And if you want to love somebody forever, love them every day
Mm.
and wake up every morning and tell them I love you today. Now, the other person has to be able to tolerate not knowing if you're going to love them tomorrow, right? That's what the balance of need and love. Because what happens is that you meet someone, you get together. I'm gonna love you. We're gonna love each other forever. We're gonna have children and grandchildren, right? And you never see it again.
Mm.
And you say, well, 10 years later, well, but I told you 10 years ago, you're supposed to live with that. That's the doses you get,
Don't you
of
remember? Come on, the
promise.
one shot. Let's go.
Exactly. So you start getting into these situations where if we want to be honest with ourselves and we want to tell people that we want to be with them, let's believe it ourselves, you know. And if you feel love, whatever love means, you know, repeat it every day. Don't have people live out of promises, because then we forget that we made the promise
Mm.
and things are getting tense. So that balance of need and choice needs to always be lived day to day. And it's not easy. I mean, I don't think that you can say that there's a perfect relationship or a perfect marriage or a perfect family. It's a struggle, you know. It's a struggle to be in a relationship for a long period of time. Okay, and there's a lot of ups and downs, but you have to keep two things in perspective. One is purpose and values. What are the values that are going to drive me to the purpose I'm trying to achieve with this relationship? And that becomes, I think, important.
Well, those are the relationships we choose versus the ones we have to have, like our children, things like that, our families. But even that, we can really make decisions upon. You've talked about that before, loving somebody, but not necessarily liking them at the moment.
Yes, and again, that brings us back to kids and adolescents, right? I mean, a lot of people who don't have children never learn that you can love somebody with all your heart and not like them. In adolescence, in particular, get very confused between being liked and being loved, right? Because they think that discipline and um, rules and chores and demands from the parents are a way of letting them know that they're not liked. It's actually a way to let them know you love them, and that you want the best for them, right? Now, if you haven't had children, it's kind of hard to see that, and you can go a whole life without knowing that it's okay to not like the people you love, and you have to remind them once in a while, I love you very much, but right now I don't like you, and that's okay. That doesn't have to be like, oh my God, we're getting a divorce or we're separating, or no. We have to accept that we're not likable 100% of the time. Nobody
I
is.
I certainly know I'm not.
So it's important to keep that in mind because otherwise we start building up, right? And then we start expecting somebody else to take care of the problems we have, right? And if you love me, you should treat me differently, you know, and on and on and on. So the idea is we have to be responsible for the things that we control. And the other thing that we control is what we do and the choices we make. We need to stop pointing fingers. I mean, we are where we are right now in the midst of the COVID and the political situation. Just keep pointing fingers at each other, right? I mean, when the kid's just pointing a finger at me, I just grab the finger and turn it around, and pointing at them. Because the question is, what are you going to do? I mean, don't come and dump all this pain and difficulties and telling me that I should take it away from you. I can guide you into how you can cope with it in a less destructive way, I can take it away from you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And again, having worked with you for a while now, I've seen you do this with people. Did it with me to a certain extent when we were doing all of our stuff. And yeah, you say all the time, I don't heal anything, I don't cure anything. I give you options, I support you, but the work has to be done. It's like somebody losing weight. You can tell them all the exercises, all the food to eat, but unless they actually go do it, nothing's going to change.
Yeah, and a lot of people in general, um, I mean, invariably, when I have a patient that comes to see me and he's suffering, and I ask him, what brings you to my office? Or how do you want me to help you? They all want to be happy, right? And that includes me. I want to be happy too. But happiness is a very high bar, right? I think that we have bought into the idea that we are entitled to happiness, right? And that anything that takes us away from happiness is a bad thing. And I think that we need to get honest with ourselves and understand that it's okay to just be content, right? And then have periods of happiness when you have good times, right? But the goal is to be content. Because if you, especially if you're a teenager and you expect to be happy all the time, you're gonna have a lot of miserable days, right? Because you're setting your goals to a level that are not achievable. Nobody can be happy all the time. It's not natural. Okay. We were supposed to be roaming the deserts and the mountains looking for food, and to bring it to the tribe and feed our people, right? I mean, I can assure you that half of the people don't like half of the things you do every day. And that's okay, as long as they like the other half. But there's this fantasy that we bought into that, hey, we have to be happy, right? So I think that we have a lot of room, right, to learn and to listen. And I've said it before, we have to listen more and talk less. I mean, that's hard for me to say because I talk a lot. But when I'm working, most of what I do is listening, right? I don't talk a lot unless I have something to say. Right? Otherwise, I just won't get into it. Right?
And to that, somebody's a parent. They have an adolescent kid. How do they develop those skills? How would you coach a parent to say, you know what, I'm going to teach you a little bit of what I do so you can function better with your child, understand what's going on. Is there a way to do that, or is it just purely God given and empirical from your 30 plus years? Any advice you can give those people out there listening?
Well, you see, you the first word of advice is start early, right? Okay. Don't be afraid of your kids. Okay? Don't be afraid of discipline as long as you're not disciplining kids in an angry, abusive way. I think that you need to educate your kids to boundaries. And we're talking about kids who are not pathological kids, just kids in general. I mean, hugging, kissing, touching your kids. Don't be afraid of touching your kids. Okay. I mean, I've seen parents right now, they're always phobic about their kids. They don't want to touch them. They don't want to be accused of anything, right? So you need to keep your purpose in perspective. You need to let your kids know that you're available. And you have to spend time with your kids. You have to play with them, right? It doesn't mean that you have to put them in a pedestal and nothing bad will ever happen to them, you know? But they need to know that when they come to you, they need to feel safe, right? So it's not what you say, it's not what you do, it's how do you approach it? Is your neutrality, your listening, they're asking them, how can I help, right? I am here. And you start early with that, right? Until you get to the teenage years and where you have to allow them to take a little more risk, okay? And you set the boundaries. I think I've told you this before when your stepdaughter was younger. Um, and it was that we raise our kids till the age of 12. From 13 forward, we contain them. Okay. So the question is, how are you going to be doing your containment in an empathic way? Understanding that if your kids don't get positive attention as they grow older, they're going to get negative attention. I can assure you of that. They're going to get your attention one way or another. So you need to decide as a parent how you're going to give them your attention.
You know, one of your best students you haven't seen for a while, actually did see her briefly last week, is my wife. Initially, she had her challenges with that. Of course, you know, the family dynamic. But as our stepdaughter became older, my wife clicked into a new mode where she listens empathically. She doesn't judge. She has heard things sometimes, especially as the stepdad. I'm like, oh my God, I didn't want to know my kid was involved with that. But her kid has never hidden anything from her, basically from high school on. We know everything, and it's that communication. Dad's different, I'm a little different, but mom has been able to keep that lines of communication open for so long. And again, sometimes you hear some things you don't want to hear, or that scare you, but she's
Often.
amazingly good at it. Yes, often, but she's been so good at it. And then to be able to communicate the options, very much like you do. Okay, well, here are your options, kiddo. This is what we can do, and then I can support you in this. She's done very well with that. You'd be very proud.
That's good. Hey, listen, we're getting close to the end of today's podcast. I think that for most people, we want them to keep listening to what we have to say. I think that we have something to say, and I think there's more coming every week, same time, Tuesdays 5:30 Arizona time.
Yeah, and you know, I hope that you out there start sending some questions to us. We'd love to listen and actually respond to you in real time. Of course, if you're not listening now, please put some comments on the YouTube channel as it gets popped up later. Of course, subscribe. Give us your input. This is your show, even though we run it. It's the only you, and we literally mean that. It's you out there, and we want to make sure that you have the right information. Dr. Kino's here to help with that and for me to facilitate a little bit. Mentioned in the last podcast that yes, I am not just an MC, I guess, of this show. I'm also a patient of Dr. Kino's. I've worked with him for 12 years now, maybe longer at this point.
Yes.
And have watched.
Yeah, and
I've watched you and experienced how you work with people.
I think that we're going to have some more exciting topics to discuss. I'm particularly interested in talking about ketamine and psychedelics, and we may bring a third party next time to join us and give us some ideas of what's going on in that environment, because I think that the whole psychedelic ketamine thing is going to be a big revolution in psychiatry. So we'll talk a lot more about that. And thank you very much for everybody for listening. Okay.
Absolutely wonderful.
Thanks.
We'll see you next
Take care.
time.
Yes. Finished.